Let me give it to the mayor of Austin, Texas.
Thanks, Rod. All right. I am Parker Lewis. I work on Zapwrite, formerly at Unchained. As Rod mentioned, helped run it while it was the Commons, and now just anything Rod tells me to do, I do. So, but we're very thankful from our friends in Nashville coming down and helping organize Bitcoin Park Austin. So appreciate you guys being here and the team at Bitcoin Park organizing. We have two people who've been in and around Bitcoin for a long time, Tuur Demeester and Adam Back. I'll give brief intros, but I want to have each of them explain a little bit of their origin stories to Bitcoin before we get into some of the meat of the conversation. Adam is the CEO of Blockstream and co-founder, and he was one of the 8 people cited, one of the 8 works cited in the Bitcoin white paper for Hashcash and proof of work, basically helping or a solution put forward to defend against email spam. And Tuur Demeester is, I would say, researcher, economist, analyst, investor. He's been recommending Bitcoin since 2011. I got to see him. I think we had met once. I got to see him talk at the Bush Presidential Center in 2017 or 18 with speaking against, or not against, but counter Robert Kaplan, the Fed president at the time in Dallas. And I believe Tuur's been recommending Bitcoin since it was like 11 cents or 6 cents, somewhere in and around there, before it had a dollar sign on it.
$5 actually.
$5. Hey,
for
being
the 5
honest,
cents, that's Trace Mayer.
Okay.
Yes,
you
yes.
know, say, look at that integrity. What's the difference?
Looking back.
But could each of you, I think, Adam, maybe you could start. Satoshi actually emailed you before the white paper was released, if I remember correctly. One of the funny things, I don't think Brian Bishop is here, but one of our friends here in Austin, Brian Bishop, has a great part in Bitcoin history because he was on the mailing list and he was one of the first people to write back to Satoshi saying that this would never work. And he's very proud of that. If you could talk a little bit about your history, both before white paper and then what ultimately got you into Bitcoin.
Yeah, so I was one of the people on the cypherpunks list interested in kind of self-sovereignty and privacy technology. So the cypherpunks were, there's a saying, cypherpunks write code. In fact, 99% of them were just, doing the equivalent of Twitter philosophizing. But there were coders, and Hal Finney was one of them, I was one of them, I know like half a dozen people. But there was interest to implement things. They'd implemented anonymous remailers. Hal Finney added encryption to it. But they implemented things like Tuur, like prototypes of it. But the thing they really wanted to implement that was kind of holy grail application was anonymous bearer electronic cash. But it turned out that was hard to do. There's a company in the Netherlands, David Chom's company, that tried to do it, but they had a central database with all of the spent coins in it. And so there was a prototype you could play with, and a few of us tried to they promised they'd only issue 1 million coins. And so some of the cypherpunks took it on themselves to try and abuse that to sort of force it to have a value by just starting to trade with it and so we could float a value. But unfortunately, and I sold a couple of things like RSA t-shirts and stuff with it, but unfortunately the company went bankrupt and the double spent database probably got sold for spare computer parts in an auction, and that was the end of all the coins. You couldn't tell if they were spent or not. So after that, the question on the cypherpunks list was what went wrong and how can we design something that wouldn't have that fate? And the lesson really was that it has to be decentralized, and that's much harder to do. So I was running one of the remailers, which is providing email privacy, and people were spamming through it strategically, not for commercial reasons, but try to sort of annoy people so they would block remailers, basically. So it's kind of tactical spamming. So usually when people try to combat spam, they will block the IP address, block the email address, but you can't do that through a mailer because you don't know who's sending it. So it forced me to think about spam in a different way. And so, if you had an electronic cash system, you could have paid people to receive the email, but that was a circular problem, right? No electronic cash system. DigiCash had just gone under and it was centralized, and the only way to put money into it was with a bank account. So not very decentralized. So I hit on the idea of using proof of work to sort of create a verifiable stamp. Within days of so I just had the idea, then I kept quiet and rushed off and implemented it and posted it on the list. And so that seemed to, within days, cause a lot of people to think that, this is digital scarcity, this looks like digital gold, and realize that it could be part of a solution to solve the DigiCash problem so that you could mine the coins and then you wouldn't need to work with a bank. DigiCash was basically a stable coin, a very private anonymous one, but a centralized stable coin. So proof of work became part of the conversation for all of the later things like B-Money, BitGold, Halfpenny's RPAL, and later Bitcoin. So how I heard about Bitcoin is I got an email from this guy called Satoshi Nakamoto. I thought that was his real name. When I looked at it afterwards, it did actually say anonymousspeech.com, so it probably should have been a hint. But anyway, I assumed it was just a researcher because occasionally I would get email from like a programmer or a startup or a researcher who's like using the Hashcash in some other crypto stuff I had online, like library stuff. They'd have a question or they'd give you their paper to read. So it just felt like another one of those. So I interacted with him a bit, and then, Bitcoin was published in January 2009. So I think it was the first email that he'd sent. So that's my introduction to Bitcoin. But, like everybody, you have your regrets, which is I should have immediately started mining in 2009, but I didn't actually do anything until 2013. Obviously, that was a mistake.
What made you come back to it?
Well, I should have seen it coming because I was participating in this attempt to bootstrap the DigiCash demo value, but I was thinking, well, it's very cool. He solved the problems that, the people that were trying before failed to figure out a solution for. Okay, inflation control. And basically they were myself and others were trying to sort of artificially create a stable coin, which is very hard to do in a decentralized system because it doesn't know the price. What Satoshi did is he turned it around and to just control the supply curve and let the market tell you what it's worth. For some reason, nobody saw that before. And he solved a bunch of cool, elegant technical solutions to some of the other problems. When I saw it, I was like, oh, that's cool, but let's see if anybody uses it, right? Because it had no price, almost no users for a few years, right? So I just see it, continue working on the startup I was with and look for news once in a while to pop up. I was looking for signs of life that it was bootstrapping, and I wasn't looking real carefully, so I just see things on Slashdot like Bitcoin price is $1, and then a while later Bitcoin price is $100. It's hard to argue that's not bootstrapped, actually. That's like $1 billion, right? So then I started reading a lot more details about how it works and asking developers annoying questions to catch up with the details. Yeah,
one of the things that I read recently that I hadn't seen before was that both Nick Szabo and Wei Dai, when they learned that it had a fixed supply, they're like, I wish I had known this, I would have told him not to do that. And that in hindsight, it looks so obvious now, but that it wasn't obvious. Tell us I don't even think I know your origin story to Bitcoin, but what made it first make sense to you and when?
Yeah, first of all, after all these years, I still feel like I'm just a lucky hitchhiker, and this is just the most incredible adventure, especially in the company of cryptographer luminaries like Adam. But yeah, so my background was economic. I had been studying the Austrian school for a while, and basically the main impulse where my interest from Bitcoin came from was I was just scared of bankruptcies in Europe because I was living in Europe at the time. I was scared of the euro failing completely, and I was looking around for what's out there. I do remember I heard the son of Milton Friedman, David Friedman, do a talk on anonymous eCash in 2010, but I never really thought that was something people were actually, I don't know. I missed that at the time. But what I did do is I traveled to Latin America to learn how do people on a day-to-day basis deal with financial systems that are completely broken and where you can't even go to the bank to get cash and those kind of things. And so, yeah, it was literally in Buenos Aires that my friends there were mining Bitcoin in their basement, and they explained to me about Bitcoin, and it was the perfect introduction.
You two have a history. Adam, could you just talk a little bit about, you guys have known each other for a long time, but just to connect for everyone, how you guys know each other and some of that history?
Yeah, so I think the first conference I went to, or maybe the second conference, was a small conference in Amsterdam, and I didn't know anybody, so I asked Manny Rosenfeld, who I'd known from online, could he introduce me to some people? And one of the people he introduced me to was Vitalik Buterin. And so when I got to the conference, he was trying to persuade people about the quantum computing kind of scam, which is a bit infamous. Anyway, so other than that experience, I think that's the place I got to meet Demeester.
What do they say about tigers and stripes or leopards and spots? But yeah, I remember that conference quite well. Yeah, 2013. I remember trying to figure out whether the conference itself wasn't a scam because I didn't know who was organizing it. But yeah, that was one of the very first in Europe. I think it was maybe the third one after Prague and London. But yeah, one of the earlier ones.
And so I want you both to answer this question in terms of how Bitcoin from the early days of when you first got involved to today has advanced the most, really speaking from technological and capability infrastructure standpoint. But before, there was an interview that you did several years ago, Adam, where you talked about when you first started really paying attention to Bitcoin, that you tried to figure out various different ways to improve it, and that you ultimately realized that there was not a lot of design space to improve it. Could you just talk about that process that you went through and how you came to think about that?
Yeah, so this was in 2013 when I started to try and understand more of the internal details of how it works. So I read what was available online, which wasn't much. There's a lot more material these days. And somebody had written a code walkthrough, so I read that. I was too lazy to try and reverse engineer all the details from the code, so I just tried to find where the developers were, and I found them hanging out on Bitcoin Wizards IRC, and I spent some months asking them kind of naive questions that got less naive over time about how things worked. And so after I felt like I'd mostly caught up, I figured, well, let's, I've implemented previous electronic cash systems like the crypto libraries. I had a background in distributed systems from university, so I knew about the Byzantine generals problem before I heard about Bitcoin, which is a reverse of what most people have. And so I figured, well, that's cool, but surely there's a way to improve it. So let me see what I can do. Spent about 4 months of my free time, of course, getting down the Bitcoin rabbit hole and trying to improve it. And to my surprise, that basically turned out to be impossible. That you'd think, well, we'll make it so that people can mine in smaller amounts, so they could do it on the CPU in tiny amounts, rather than having to mine a whole block, or without using pools, or decentralize the pools, and all of these things. And everything you do, you change it like this, but it makes two other things worse. And so everything you try to improve, you just make more things worse. So it turned out that basically it exists in this narrow design space where anything much different breaks it and just makes it less efficient. Now, since then, many of the altcoins, there's thousands of altcoins, and some of them repeat the ideas that I discarded and threw away because they made things work, but they do them anyway, and then they find out the hard way why that doesn't work. But in any case, it seems like there's not much you can do to improve Bitcoin. The only thing I thought of that might have worked was there was a 1999 paper called Auditable Anonymous Electronic Cash that I'd read because I was trying to implement and think about electronic cash. And I realized that didn't rely on a central database. It was compatible with the data that it had being broadcast. And that actually is the paper cited by Zero Coin, an academic paper some years later. So I kind of hit on the idea and they optimized it for Bitcoin. But the problem with that is it's, the coins are large, but that's the only thing I could find. And I think it's interesting because it's a fair intuition that the first version of anything technological is usually improved by orders of magnitude later. So you think about, automobile, airplane, AI software. So it's a natural and fair intuition. That's why you get this phenomenon that people wade into Bitcoin and you've got the superhero cape, new to Bitcoin, here to fix it. It's a natural inclination because you would expect that a piece of technology would be improvable. It seems not, so I try to analogize what else looks like that. Maybe the discovery of DNA encoding, or things that just seem to work and underlie everything, or the internet itself. You could make a different internet, but the one we have is pretty robust, has a massive network effect. So there's no point, basically. So something in that direction.
Yeah, I always think about the fact that there are 50,000 times that someone's tried to make a better Bitcoin, and I always go back to that interview that Adam gave and thinking about it that way, that if you try to improve one thing, it makes something worse over here. Talk about, and it doesn't have to be one thing, but from when you first adopted Bitcoin and started saving in Bitcoin to today, how has Bitcoin advanced the most? And I won't prejudice the question with a specific direction other than saying, from the technological and capability standpoint.
Well, it's a lot easier to use in so many ways. Even just trying to hold some Bitcoin as a non-engineer was really kind of a challenge to figure out, where do I go? How do I generate a private key with this computer who by default is connected to the internet, so I can't do that. So I need some software, but I get it from the internet, but then some, open source engineer guy is going to explain to me, well, this is open source software, so that's okay, and then you can run it, and then that way. So it's you basically almost had to know someone to explain it to you, or you would kind of throw the dice and you get lucky and you could store it. There were several exchanges that where people got rug pulled even before Mt. Gox, so it's just the story of losing your coins is as old as time, but it's gotten easier to not lose them as quickly.
So custody. Adam, your perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the layer twos on Bitcoin have been interesting, and that has surprised to the upside because I think there was some indication that Satoshi had some lightning-like ideas in the early Bitcoin, but they weren't very functional. And so that was improved to the point of viability. There were two groups that independently discovered a similar idea. One was Christian Decker doing a PhD at ETZH in Zurich, and he, put into the academic peer review his duplex multi-channel paper, and while he was waiting for the peer review, Joseph Poon and Taj Draja published their Lightning paper, and they were almost identical concepts, so it's kind of simultaneous invention. And so, of course, the details took some years to perfect, and there were kind of glitches or unexpected things developed over some years. But today it's extremely functional, and there's a lot of people using it globally, and it just works. And I think the other thing that's sort of positively surprising is people thought, well, maybe that's all you can do. People are finding new, innovative ways to use Bitcoin layer 1 to build layer 2 things, all the time. And like Arc was another one, and the recent one, like BitVM, is kind of, surprising that that's even possible, right? So sort of verifying parts of zero-knowledge proof using today's Bitcoin script. And you're like, how's that even possible? Well, it's kind of a twist where they make it like Lightning, where there's a challenge, right? So you lock some coins up. If the other guy cheats, it's too expensive to prove the zero-knowledge proof, but you can prove that he lied in his zero-knowledge proof in log scale, so much more efficiently. And so that's what Jimmy Song was talking about earlier. They were the users trying to put this 160-byte anchor transaction in the main chain, and they actually do care about decentralization because they really don't want it to get censored or they could lose money.
I would just add, I think that layer 2 is really revolutionary because if you think about it, the reason why so many altcoins and whatever they call it now, crypto, popped up was because people didn't believe what Adam just said, is that you can build any functionality you can think of on a higher architectural level. You don't always have to do everything on the main chain. And people just didn't believe that for the longest time. And then just engineers just decided, well, I can't just keep arguing on Bitcoin Talk and online. I'm just going to build layer 2. And that's what they did. And now it's the best proof thinkable. And that's why the money is also now just coming back home to Bitcoin. That's where everything is happening and where it should happen. But I think it's a really monumental achievement to have all this layer 2 activity because it was not obvious at all. And even even conceptually, it was not obvious. You would go to conferences and 80% of the Bitcoiners, they would kind of talk about you need bigger blocks or we need to kind of, have a way to increase the throughput somehow. And they just often didn't believe you could, build a Lightning or build do a federated sidechain and those kind of things.
So I was going to ask from how it's advanced from the past to the present and then looking to the future. But before I ask that, because we're here today in the present, where do each of you think the greatest risks are to Bitcoin? And then I'll use that to go into the question of where we see Bitcoin advancing the most from here. Adam, would you like to start?
I think most of the risks that people worried about when we started Blockstream, in 2013, the year before, have largely failed to materialize. I think there was greater concern about kind of bugs in the base protocol, and I think the QA has gone up and the bugs that were there have been squashed, and so it's much less likely that any major bugs reside there. And then the other big concern at that point was that there'd be a coordinated multi-government crackdown and ban of Bitcoin. They wouldn't like permissionless internet money, and they would try to stop it before it started. And here we are, and the current U.S. administration is talking about Bitcoin Reserve, and probably over half the states in the U.S. are talking about reserves in their state. So the regulators haven't reacted in a big way, and it's kind of moved past that. So that's positive. The other risk that people like to talk about is quantum, but I think that's not that big of an issue because NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the U.S., is working on post-quantum signature standard, and Bitcoin can use what they propose or pick a version that is better suited for Bitcoin's stronger security requirements than general. I think that risk is not so bad either. So I think there's a lot of risks left, really.
So Tuur, I'll frame it to you this way. If it were to be something technological or technological breaking, maybe quantum, or centralization, censorship, or just changes to the code or economic incentives, is there a area that you would look to as a risk or that your concern, not necessarily concern in the sense of like, oh, Bitcoin's at risk of failing, but just where you pay attention to.
Yeah, I would say in a word, the biggest risk is complacency. It's just losing track of the cypherpunk values that made this project come to life in the first place, and just forgetting why it was important that we had, sovereign money and sovereign, even the idea of like having, private property, all the kind of things you can do with that. I think that is the biggest risk for just the world as a whole, that we just forget why so much effort was expended in the last 15 years and before, in the decades before, to make this a reality. Because, if people stop running full nodes, if people stop thinking about self-custody, taking part in custody arrangements, if they all just kind of send it to whatever the biggest custodian is, well, then we might as well have $1, because they're going to give us vouchers, and they can start lying about, the ratio of voucher to Bitcoin.
Yeah, for me, when I went out of the country and loaded up a hardware wallet and was able to send Bitcoin, that was one of the things that connected for me why Bitcoin was so powerful. I think that what you keyed on there is in terms of complacency of thinking that Bitcoin's already succeeded, that it can't fail, and that, these lessons that people in the past have learned, that we need to hold our own keys and run nodes and choose our own relay policies. Those things are all important. How you see Bitcoin advancing from here, and this doesn't necessarily have to be just technological. I think at the end, I want to get to what you see a Bitcoin standard looking like and what it looks like between then and now. But how do you see Bitcoin, the network, from here into the future the most?
Just briefly on the previous topic, there was an idea popularized about anti-fragility in Bitcoin. And I think some people thought naively that the code was automatically anti-fragile, but effectively the anti-fragility is the users and the activist investors who will make a noise, and if there's something bad happening in the network, they will act in the market, they'll short it, they will, if there's a fork or something. So I think we are the anti-fragility. So then, as Tuur says, you have to be vigilant. As to future, I think that there's an idea about ossification, because generally speaking, a rapid rate of change in the base layer is risk. And so you see a lot of, if you ask some investors what features they want in Bitcoin, their answer is just don't break it. They're happy with it as it is, right? So you've got to bear that in mind, because there's a lot of people's money invested in the network. So that makes ossification desirable, and basic TCP/IP hasn't changed in decades, right? There's IPv6, but basic fundamentals haven't changed. And so, but unfortunately, I think we're not quite ready to do that, because people are trying to build layer 2s on top of Bitcoin base layer, and the base layer scripting system is a bit limiting. And so I think that's why there's an interest in things like BitVM, in Covenants, and Blockstream picked up a project that some of the core developers have been proposing, which is now called Simplicity, to make a sort of more self-extensible way, kind of microcode for programmers. If you think about it, it's kind of like a microcode, so you could implement opcodes. If Bitcoin had Simplicity today, you wouldn't have needed a soft fork to do Schnorr signatures. You just could have coded them in microcode and then start using them. So it's kind of more permissionless, and it makes it plausible that you can really freeze that could be the last soft fork. We hope to have that in Liquid pretty soon, like in the next quarter or so. We've got the release candidate and a release kind of vehicle figured out. And there are a few things that came in Liquid first, effectively SegWit and some of the time lock opcodes. It has Covenants, it had Schnorr signatures, and some of those things came into Bitcoin, but usually like 5 to 8 years later. So I just want to say that just because we put something in Liquid doesn't mean that's coming in Bitcoin anytime soon, but maybe that's an appropriate time frame for Bitcoin to conservatively figure out something. So that's one path to ossification. The other path is adding more opcodes like Covenants and so on. But I feel that it's a bit incremental, and each opcode is kind of like adding a new CISC instruction to an Intel CPU. There's always going to be another one, and people are never going to be satisfied, and they're going to debate intensely which opcode is more important. Whereas if you have a generic low-level extensibility, that could maybe be less controversial in a way because there's less design choices.
Tuur, what do you think in terms of how Bitcoin advances the most from where it is today in, say, the next 5 years?
Well, my focus has always been more, the people that are handling Bitcoin and markets and those kind of things. And so what I'm seeing is, that we're moving, because of adoption, we're moving more and more from cipher space where everything is very low trust and that's fantastic, of course, like not to have to trust anyone. But as more and more people adopt it, we're getting more and more into the meat space where, obviously people are handling Bitcoin, people are making deals in Bitcoin, making promises. And so it gets all a lot more tangible and kind of, dirty sometimes. Like, for example, with the recent hack or problem that Coinbase had, like very much a sign of like, okay, this is what happens once you start to have to trust people with certain things because whatever the law requires it or because, our organization just tends to work like this. And so I think that building institutions in the meat space is one of the challenges for Bitcoin for the next 5, 10, probably 100 years. Because, it's extremely young. Of course, there's all kinds of grouping. We're having young organizations pop up. But really to think about, like, what would it look like to build an institution that's made out of humans who have certain values, like just moral values, who understand those very well, and that institution can last for 100 years. Like, what would that look like? I think that's one of the big challenges for Bitcoin so that we can extend the kind of reliability of Bitcoin into society and maybe even start fixing some of the existing institutions that haven't been able to keep up with their promises.
So, Adam, you'd mentioned that maybe a protocol advancement. There's a lot of things that you guys do at Blockstream, the consumer side of your business, the enterprise side of the business, and asset management. Where, from a company perspective and product perspective, are you most focused on in terms of accelerating Bitcoin?
Well, I mean, we are kind of Bitcoin mission people, so we tend to look at any bottleneck, as Sean just said, and try to fix it. So, we got into mining, we got into broadcasting data via satellites to kind of reduce the risk of the Great Firewall of China and things like that, and into asset management because of the dollar liquidity shortages in the Bitcoin space. So with Sean Bill's background from the hedge fund and the pension fund, we thought we would try to present a vehicle that they could invest into from a pension fund to bring dollars into the Bitcoin ecosystem, into the Bitcoin markets. There's a lot, there are many kind of applications for dollars related to Bitcoin that could, instantly place $1 billion in a week if somebody had the dollars and would lend it at reasonable terms. And so it's a shortage of dollars that's an issue. So we figured we'd try to address that. And of course, if you're addressing any inefficiency, it's a form of arbitrage. So you're going to make money while helping people, basically. So, the answer to your question is like, we attack everything that looks like it could use improving around Bitcoin in terms of, consumer user experience, hardware wallet security, moving on to custody because there are, companies with Bitcoin and custodians with Bitcoin and, even government agencies and countries. It's just a kind of path for a different form of wallet to address that kind of institutional use case where you have, a workflow and multiple approvers and key management. So it's a little more extension of a kind of multi-sig idea, right? So Blockstream Green was, I think, the first wallet to have a multi-sig in a software wallet.
So, Adam, you're talking about...
By the way, I'm always impressed with how vertical Blockstream is. Like, there's just so many levels at which the company is active. It's always fascinating to hear.
There's both of you talked about in different ways Adam, you're talking about building infrastructure to help institutions adopt, not just institutions, but Tuur, you were talking about institutions from a more of a cultural perspective, what they might look like in the future as more people that have these Bitcoin-aligned values get together. How do you see the game theory playing out? Tuur, let's start with you. In terms of there's nation states adopting Bitcoin, there are Bitcoin treasury companies popping up, mimicking Michael Saylor. There are increasingly financial institutions getting involved in Bitcoin. How do you see that moving forward, and how do you think the cultural side of Bitcoin influences that in terms of who might be successful? And their institutions are people, even if they're financial institutions, but attracting talent either to companies or to jurisdictions. You want to start?
I guess I would say I find myself thinking, to me, it's kind of like just the game theory is there. And so it's a race, and, you can't really predict It's kind of like how a wildfire starts. It's like you can't really predict which direction it's going to go. You just know that it's dry and that here's a match and that's how the wind blows and, it's just going to happen. And maybe the wind will change and that's the thing you can't predict. But so what interests me more in terms of like really trying to think things through is not necessarily who's going to have Bitcoin in the next 10 years, but more like if you fast forward, 50 years, who will have had the stamina to keep it? Once we have this adoption that just ripples around the world, at what level are we going to find that somehow the Bitcoin sticks the most? Like, is it going to be individuals? Is it going to be, maybe like generational businesses? Is it going to be nation states? Is it going to be somehow a town, like on the town level or on the city level? I think, the reason why try to think about that is just that I think that's where the educational efforts will pay off the most, because that's where the longevity is. That's where also we can learn from those people because they know something about low time preference that maybe I don't understand yet. So I don't know. That's just my thinking about game theory these days.
What about you, Adam? How do you see different dominoes falling?
Yeah, it was interesting what Tuur's talking about in terms of how the future adopts Bitcoin. I think the thing that kind of worries people going back, earlier in Bitcoin's cycle is that whether something will go wrong as it scales to the next level, because people were hypothesizing about governments buying Bitcoin or public companies buying Bitcoin years ago with a bit of trepidation that, they'll find a way to, make something worse or break some kind of game theory assumption. But interestingly, Bitcoin's game theory seems to scale in the sense that, what worked for people mining Bitcoin on laptops and using software wallets seems to continue to work with, increasingly large private company miners, public company miners, treasury companies, and even ETFs, in the sense that it seems that incentives matter in a really strong way, and it's influencing all of the people that it touches. So that, now you've got politicians that seem to be genuine erstwhile Bitcoin supporters, and it's influencing their thinking. Now, of course, that's not the case in all cases, but you can see that it's the game theory seems to be robust and to survive scaling up. I think that's I'm kind of an organic markets outlook type of person. So if that works, then I'm content to see how it percolates through society and the markets. Because a lot of what happens with Bitcoin seems to be markets driven. So we touched on the fork drama as a kind of risk point in Bitcoin's history. And, people can still debate a bit about what happened. But to my point of view is the market prevailed. So what the holders and investors in Bitcoin wanted was what happened. And of course, it was scary at the time and people weren't sure what was going to happen. But if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense because you've got, radical free market type of money, hard money, that a contest would be resolved in the market. So, it gives some confidence that that will continue to be the case and that people will draw lessons from that being the outcome the first time. So there's more predictability now and there's less reason to try and, fight the free market and, create a drama about it. I think that's be interesting to see that lesson repeat now that some other kind of contest that results in that kind of situation repeat or be, abandoned because they know how it's going to go once you've got, now that we have public market companies and governments and other entities involved. But it's also, I think, a good reason to want to, try to get to the ossification because you don't want to have that kind of drama when it's at global scale because I think then it becomes a kind of,
We could start wars over it.
Yeah, it just becomes, there's so much money and so much at stake that maybe governments start to have an opinion and, global settlement banks and things like that, which is not the type of people that you want to be having a protocol level discussion with, let's say. So I think the internet itself had some governance tussles where, government agencies started to care about the security of DNS and how DNS is designed and who can override domains in domain disputes. So I think ultimately they were able to kind of get the technical guys to focus on the technical and make kind of policy groups that mostly left them alone. So it's sort of some engineering around the policy management. But yeah, I think it'd be good if Bitcoin got ossified before it got too close to that.
All right, I'm going to ask the same question, but in a different way to both of you as the last one. We got 5 minutes, and I think we'll have time for a few questions here. This is on what happens between now and a Bitcoin standard. And for Adam, I'm going to ask the question vis-a-vis other, you mentioned fork wars and basically Bitcoin competing against different visions of Bitcoin, and it's been competing against various different, 50,000 copycats of Bitcoin within the crypto world. But vis-a-vis other fiat currencies, gold, stable coins, how do you think a future on a Bitcoin standard looks like? Do they coexist? Is it one currency to rule them all? And then, Tuur, I'll ask you a cultural question about what the Bitcoin standard looks like.
I mean, I think it's it's a longer question whether Bitcoin ultimately displaces fiat currency or becomes, the gold backing for fiat currencies, because many fiat currencies used to have partial gold backing. The Swiss franc is the most recent to leave that in 1999, which is shockingly recent compared to other countries. And they had a 20% gold reserve for the currency, and they had a referendum some years back to try and bring it back. And there's another referendum initiative at the moment by some Swiss Bitcoiners trying to do another referendum to add back the gold and add Bitcoin to it. So that'll be an interesting kind of exercise because they have to collect, 100,000 votes from a population of about 8 million. And so I think, the kind of more incremental thinking markets viewpoint that first thing is let's see if Bitcoin can compete with gold on a market cap basis. We are, even though the macro uncertainty has pushed the price of gold up to about 21 trillion market cap, Bitcoin is, closer than ever, right? It's only 10 times away. So if you'd asked anybody if Bitcoin would compete with gold in 2013, they would have thought you're crazy. So, I think it's getting closer, and then we'll see how it shakes out from there. But, I'm assuming that fiat currencies continue, but just with governments holding Bitcoin reserves as an initial stage, and then we'll see if that, if something changes about the fractional reserve system. Of course, one catalyst could be the US reserve currency status being challenged. It seems like it's not being challenged in a hard way, but in a soft way, kind of multi-fiat kind of rebalancing, weakening of the US dollar perhaps being on the cards. So we'll see how that plays out. Next catalyst to watch.
You'll be holding Bitcoin with your own keys and not the fiat currency, correct?
Oh, yeah.
So more culturally, in terms of when you look forward to a Bitcoin standard, what do you see that looking like? I know you've thought a lot about the ideas of Bitcoin urbanization. You talked about the idea of of an institution that's formed around the ideals of Bitcoin, but you also have ideas about kind of building a different version of the future and what you think that might look like. Can you talk about maybe the path to getting there and what you see and how you see Bitcoin impacting society culturally?
Yeah, I guess there's maybe two ways of thinking about it. Like, one is that the Bitcoin culture will somehow, it'll seep through all the cracks of the cultural cracks of the world, and everybody is gonna kind of become like cypherpunk enlightened. And in that sense, fix the money, fix the world is gonna happen. And then the other idea is that, or the other way to look at it is probably that Bitcoin is a mechanical improvement. And it because knowledge is not distributed equally, we have now a special moment in time in history where a certain group of people will benefit from knowing that earlier than others. And that's going to happen once. And then, of course, our systems will change. Like there will be an ability to save to a greater extent than there was in the past, to not be taxed at every step of the way, every second of the day. But that doesn't mean that society is fixed with that. And so I think, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I think the second scenario is the real one, is what's actually happening. And so the challenge is then how do we use this momentum to do something good instead of just repeating just the naive self-inflated ideas about, we're so great. We must be so great because we're so rich, and so therefore whatever we do is going to be great. I don't think you can stick, 1,000 Bitcoiners on an island and it's going to turn into some kind of citadel that will still be there 1,000 years from now. I think you need a lot more cultural depth to an identity to really know who you are and what you're about. And I don't think that'll come from Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin will be adopted by certain groups who've kind of run with it in a great way. And so I want to find those groups and I want to learn from what that is, because I really do think that the West is in trouble, in deep trouble. And we need to find ways to repair and revitalize institutions that maybe shouldn't have withered in the first place.
We call one of those groups Texans.
So about the, because I was talking about gold being the first target, but I don't want to come across pessimistic either, because it's not very far away. And I think, Hal Finney, I think this was 10th of January 2009, done their first transaction on the 9th of January. There was no economic value, almost no users. And he put out this thought experiment to say that he thought the addressable market for Bitcoin was $200 trillion. He was thinking big, that's $10 million a coin. And I think it's probably more now because we've undergone a lot of QE and inflation. But I think that's actually, you can still have fiat currencies, and that can be true because there are a lot of financial instruments that are assets that are, suffering from a monetary premium. So people will buy real estate and not use it just because they're trying to save their assets. And that's bad, right? Increases the cost of housing, makes it unaffordable, supply off the market. There are other assets, bonds, the monetary premium in the stock market. You can see the stock market, if you take out MT, monetary expansion, it doesn't look so hot. So you can see a lot of what's happening is actually in search of a hard money alternative. So if you have Bitcoin, you can potentially suck some of that premium out of those things. And I think, the addressable market for that is probably in line with what Hal said, plus some inflation more. So I think that fiat currencies can continue to do their thing while more and more people opt out or have an easier way to preserve spending power without having to be a clever hedge fund manager to manage to beat the real inflation rate for assets.
Well, we're going to trust you to do the good work to convert all the pensions and endowments and institutional money to sell all their rental homes, collapse the monetary premium there, buy Bitcoin, and we'll all be better off. Really appreciate both of you guys coming. I get the pleasure of seeing Tuur from time to time. He's working on a new podcast called Be Real. Adam, thank you for joining us. Please, everybody, give these two gentlemen a big hand.